So it is Easter morning, as I'm assuming many of us realize. All around the world, folks will remember the man named Jesus who lived 2,000 years ago. Jesus was born into a world with many problems: poverty, slavery, oppression, greed, and he taught many truths to that world, truths that we still recognize today. That love matters, that kindness and compassion matter, that people deserve second chances, that we shouldn't judge others, that we can be renewed, transformed, become the best versions of ourselves. The story of this holiday actually begins a week ago. The story says that Jesus arrives in Jerusalem one Sunday, and many of his followers greet him waving palm fronds, those big leafy plants, laying them at his feet. You've maybe heard of Palm Sunday. Jesus had decided to come to Jerusalem to preach about the truths that he knew, and he spends a week in this bustling city. The way the story is told, during that week, he rails against the hypocrisy and lies of religious leaders as he overturns tables and gets real mad at people in the temple. He preaches love and compassion. He rests with his family and his followers. And by Thursday, he's preparing with his closest friends for the Passover Seder. Jesus was Jewish. And then they eat that ritual meal together. We know that as the Last Supper, right? That's what we call it. And at that meal, Jesus tells his followers that he knows someone's plotting against him. And that night after the big meal, he goes out to a beautiful garden to pray. And there in the garden, he's arrested. Then on what some folks now call Good Friday, which was 2 days ago, he's brought before leaders, he's convicted, he's mocked, he's tormented, and then he's killed. And that evening, he's laid to rest in a tomb by the people who love him. There's a lot happening in a very short week. And through it, the stories show Jesus doubting, praying for guidance, getting spitting mad, longing for a different fate than the one that is his, and displaying over and over again kindness and forgiveness, gentleness and love. The story goes on to say that Jesus, though dead and laying in the tomb, then rises. That's what is celebrated on Easter Sunday. It is women, his mother Mary, and others who come to visit the tomb and find that rather than the large stone blocking the entrance, it has been rolled away and the tomb is empty. And an angel there tells them that Jesus is no longer in the tomb. He is resurrected, transformed, renewed. For 2,000 years, we've been telling this story. It's a story of great love and great pain. It's a story of hope and promise, a story about what in us humans remains eternal. And we tell this story even in circles where we don't believe in a literal bodily resurrection, because we know that there are truths to be found nonetheless, the same truths that Jesus taught in his lifetime. This story teaches us about the possibility for new life, for becoming even when we feel all is lost. It's a story about hope from hopelessness. The story teaches us that each of us has within us the potential for rebirth, new beginnings, transformation into our best and highest selves, our truest and most authentic selves. The story teaches us that we are called to honor and celebrate the potential for change and growth and newness in each other, absolutely remaining open to what we and others can become. So this morning, we're going to celebrate with story and song, and the kids are going to celebrate with an egg hunt. We're going to celebrate all that is possible, all that might yet be, all the glorious beauty and diversity that is contained within each and every one of us, holy children of humanity. And keep breathing in and out. In and out. Spirit of life, spirit of love, spirit of all the world's great teachers, of wisdom and mystery and being. This morning we gather, as do people across this wide world, to remember the story of Jesus of Nazareth, the young man who taught, rebelled, resisted, a young man with a vision for what the world might become. A vision of wide embrace, compassionate love, and liberating equality. We remember that 2 days ago, many commemorated his murder, the sorrow and deep pain of Good Friday, when he died, leaving the world too young, as too many leave this world too young. As we continue to witness week after week the toll of gun violence, violence against people of color, violence against LGBTQ folks, against religious minorities and other marginalized peoples, we honor the truth of grief and pain caused by irrational anger, fear, and oppression. In the silence we breathe as our hearts cry out for a world without prejudice. We remember too that just yesterday, some versions of the story tell us that this man went down into the underworld and released the souls of the just. The promise and liberation of Holy Saturday, when story says people were set free, brought to peace. We see every day what it means to save one another. With hard work, with care, with patience, we know that freedom is possible. And we long for the day it is made real for every single one of our beloved human family. In the silence we breathe as our hearts cry out our commitment to be among the liberators. And we remember that today, the story says this young man was nowhere to be found. That he stood and walked, was freed from death. Whether we believe that literally or metaphorically, we know what it is to be given another chance. We know that a fresh start can change everything. We are grateful for the chances we have known to reinvent ourselves and become who we truly are. In the silence we breathe as our hearts cry out in gratitude for second chances. On this spring morning, filled with promise and all the flowering signs of new life, we give thanks for the community we share, for the ease of companionship, the strength of caretaking, the power of forgiveness, and the fullness of life. And today we recommit ourselves to a vision of the world in which every person is free from violence, every person knows true justice, every person has the autonomy to be themselves. We commit ourselves once again to loving all creation with our whole hearts. So may it be. We have one reading this morning. It is titled The Humanist Speaks of Easter, and it's by Kendall Gibbons. There are only two things that we know for sure. One, they stashed Jesus' body in a tomb temporarily until they could get a chance to bury it properly, and when they came back, the tomb was empty. Make of that what you will. There are many possible explanations, some more likely than others. I don't believe that Jesus came back from the dead. Neither did Martin or Malcolm. Neither did Viola Liuzzo or Frozen Safi, the women's rights activist shot by the Taliban in Afghanistan. Neither will dismember journalist Jamal Khashoggi or Alexei Navalny when he dies in a Russian prison. Neither will documentary filmmaker Brent Renaud or photographer Maxime Levin, both killed by invading armies in Ukraine. Kevin Strickland and Lamonte McIntyre will not get back the stolen decades of their lives. I don't believe that the crucifixion is a story with a happy ending or that it was a one-time event. It happens over and over as the human journey unfolds. It happens to us and to the people we love. It happens to the righteous and the innocent. Crucifixion happens and it feels like the end of the world every time. It feels like nothing could matter anymore ever. And then inevitably and miraculously something happens next. Something happens, of course it does, because the world hasn't ended yet. It's not always an empty tomb. How trite would that become? Mostly, the beloved bodies just lie right there, peacefully decomposing. But something happens, and whether we want it or not, a new chapter begins. Maybe the sun comes up, or the lilies do. Spring rolls around, that happens. Or memories come, or someone needs you. You eat food, that happens. You walk down the road and share a recollection. Life happens, keeps happening. The dead don't rise, but we do. One day it happens, you take a breath and it doesn't hurt to breathe. You start to see people again, really see them. Hope rises, community rises, you rise, we rise, life rises. Not because death isn't real, crucifixion is not just pretend, but something else is just as real, maybe even more real. Something happens next. That is the other thing we know for sure. Life rises, outrage rises, love rises, faith rises, tears rise, hope rises. This I do believe. In the 11th century, Anselm of Canterbury wrote a small but absolutely world-shifting volume titled Cur Deus Homo, which is most frequently translated as Why God Became a Human. Anselm was advancing an argument about Jesus and the crucifixion. Long before, in the 4th century, at the Council of Nicaea, doctrine had been worked out, establishing the idea of the Trinity, that God the Father, Jesus the Son, and the Holy Spirit were all one substance, one sort of essence. Later councils refined these positions, and by the Middle Ages, the Orthodox Catholic position was that Jesus was both fully human and fully divine. If any of you remember reciting the Nicene Creed or the Athanasian Creed as Catholics, you'll remember some of those ideas. Jesus is supposedly co-eternal with God, right? That notion of 3 in 1 and 1 in 3. These ideas were not scriptural. They were theological interpretations that overlaid over centuries. Unitarians, you may also remember, peeled back those ideas for themselves, reading in the Bible only the message that God is one. In Trinitarian traditions, the nature of Jesus and God is important and complex. And of course, many implications arise from the idea that Jesus was, from the moment of his birth, both human and divine. If one believes that Jesus possesses this kind of simultaneous nature, the question comes, what does it mean to crucify God, right? To kill God? And to what end would God the Father allow the Son, who's of the same substance, who is divine, to suffer in this human way? Enter Anselm. Previous theologians like Origen, way back in like the 2nd century, had argued that Jesus's life and crucifixion was a ransom paid to Satan to free humans from the devil's clutches. Okay, stay with me. Anselm takes a different tack. He argues for a substitutional theory. So put super simply, the idea is that in the Garden of Eden, humans sinned against God, and the only way for restitution to be made is by God to God's self. Because human amends to God isn't sufficient, God has to facilitate the amends. This is the idea. Only God, God's self, can make restitution to God. Okay? Yes? All right. So, while Jesus acts as a substitution for humanity in this transaction of forgiveness, because he's fully divine, right? He's God, so can make restitution to God. He also has to be human to stand in for humans, okay? So Anselm claims that humanity is redeemed by Jesus God's sacrifice to God the Father, which elicits God the Father's forgiveness of humanity. That's the equation, okay? Now, the theology might feel very circular to you, perhaps even impenetrable in its logic. But of course, for Anselm and other Trinitarians through history, ultimately it's a question of faith and mystery. Anselm was not the first, nor was he the last in the long line of Catholic theologians to put forth an interpretation of the crucifixion and the resurrection and what it all meant. Anselm's has had great staying power, though, I will say. To this day, Catholics and others work to interpret this whole story, and often they still take that starting point from Anselm. Miguel A. de la Torre, who's a professor of social ethics and Latinx studies at Iliff School of Theology in Denver, in a recent short piece, notes that with the 11th century theologian's interpretation, the story becomes one of, quote, an angry God, who then, quote, demonstrates exemplary love by offering up God's only begotten child to serve as the basis for atonement and reconciliation. Now, the implication of that, as noted by de la Torre, is that blood and pain and suffering become redemptive. And the danger of an interpretation that declares that suffering is redemptive is that we glorify the pain of others and our own pain, and that might prevent us from stopping not only the suffering actively happening, but also the systems of oppression that create that suffering. Anselm's position, which has held for centuries, during many of which this particular brand of Christianity permeated all aspects of society, has implications that have widely impacted our entire world. Now, no one needs to actually be beholden to an 11th century monastic's interpretation of the crucifixion. Not really. Not Catholics, and certainly not those of us who are part of a tradition that doesn't believe in dogma, doesn't believe in the Trinity or original sin, right? As Unitarian Universalists, our theology has always been quite divergent from that put forward by Catholics. We believe in evolution and change and growth. We believe that new learnings create new understandings and that nothing is static. In this article by de la Torre, he provocatively asks, what if crucifixion is not salvific? He proposes that instead of viewing it as Anselm did, right, as the sort of price for redemption, what if instead, he writes, we see it as, quote, an act of radical solidarity, a choice to accompany in solidarity those dying on the crosses of religious and political oppression. So in this analysis, Jesus shares the suffering of those who suffer at the hands of political leaders, right? It's not that the suffering is redemptive or atoning, but it's about siding with love. siding with the marginalized, being an ally at any cost. Of course, in many ways, De La Torre's interpretation actually really aligns with Jesus' ministry on earth. He spoke with and touched and healed people others wouldn't go near. He preached about not judging, about compassion and kindness, in a world where being different in your body or profession or religion was wrapped in stigma and punishable even by death. Jesus didn't teach that suffering was redemptive. He healed pain, and he wanted to create a world of justice and equity. Jesus preached and was killed in a world not too dissimilar from our own. We still live in a time and place where people of color, people whose bodies or identities don't align with what is considered normal as if this were a thing, a world where people whose brains work differently or whose genders don't fall in the binary experience harm at the hands of their fellow people and also their governments. You need only look at what is happening across the United States to understand that we do not yet embody the kind of radical, expansive welcome that Jesus preached. For far too long, our human siblings have experienced pain and suffering and even death, and there is nothing salvific or redemptive about the harm we as a society allow to come to people of color, neurodivergent folks, LGBTQ folks, and more. It's immoral. If there's a sin for which we need to atone, it's hardly some imagined slight against God in some faraway garden. It is the sin of how we continue to treat one another on this earth. And the atonement is creating a better and more just world, not adding to the pain and suffering. De La Torre's idea that the crucifixion is not about redemption in the face of an angry God, but rather about demonstrating compassion and solidarity with those oppressed and kept on the outside, creates a very different lesson for the Easter time. The message no longer focuses on love for the salvific and suffering figure of Jesus, but instead the focus turns to those with whom Jesus aligned himself. And we are asked to align ourselves in such a way too. As De La Torre puts it, quote, "We're asked to pick up our crosses and follow Jesus as an invitation not to suffer, but to stand in solidarity with the oppressed of the world, a solidarity which might cost us everything." Now, I'm saying this late in the day today, but you know I don't consider myself a Christian. I've shared that with you before. I don't believe Jesus was God. I don't believe in bodily resurrection. I don't believe in a devil that tries to tempt us or an angry God that has to forgive us. But these kinds of theological arguments and interpretations have shaped the world we share. And they're interesting to me, not because the idea that I have to pick up my cross resonates, but because as a student of religious experience and as someone who believes that stories matter and truths can be found and made in the epic myths and tales we tell, it matters to me how we analyze and interpret. Not just how I do it, but how you do it, how people outside of these walls do it. And it matters to me that we collectively update our understandings a millennia later, right? It matters to me that all of us find ways to make real for us the lessons buried in timeless and pervasive narratives. And as a Unitarian Universalist who believes in the prophethood and priesthood of all believers, that you and I, all of us, are capable of reading and interpreting and discarding and preserving these stories for ourselves. As a UU, I have found myself in a new place this year with my reading of the Easter story. I've never believed that Jesus' crucifixion redeemed us. And this year, I have considered again what that means, the crucifixion means. Like, what's the point, right? What is the lesson? There's so many ways to understand it, even for those of us who don't take it literally. Some years I've stood here and we've talked about rebirth, or the beauty of spring, or the idea of transformation, the potential for redemption, not from an angry God, but from each other, right? From our own sin. But this is what came into my heart this year as I sat with the story. What if the lesson of Easter is that we shouldn't have to die to experience transformation? If Jesus' death is a source of sorrow, and his transformation and rebirth is a source of joy, Shouldn't we do everything in our power to allow each other to be reinvented, reborn, renewed in the ways our hearts and souls call us to, without needing to suffer pain or death first? Shouldn't we allow each other to be who we are, to be different from one another and still be beloved? Shouldn't we, as Kendall Gibbons writes, allow life to rise and hope to rise and community to rise and you to rise and me to rise, just as we are, just as we long to be? And shouldn't we do more than just allow it? Shouldn't we encourage and support and celebrate each other as we seek to become our highest and full selves, whatever that may be? This is where we shouldn't have to die to experience renewal and transformation. We shouldn't have to suffer to become the us we long to be. We shouldn't have to know such pain just to arrive at wholeness. And we should be doing everything that we can to help each other and ourselves achieve wholeness without misery. The magic of Easter isn't in the death. The magic of Easter is in love and joy and the glory of new possibilities. It's in truth and wholeness, and the call of Easter is the call to love each other through every season, to see each other as we are, and to embrace absolutely what we might become. May we never forget our own potential to transform, and may we be ever open to the possibilities within us. May we support others as they become, always, always celebrating the journey. And may we rejoice every day in the glorious, diverse wonder of humanity as we rise together. So may it be.